All right, good afternoon. Welcome back. Some of you, welcome, everybody. I think it was a good idea to have this workshop just immediately after the PLM workshop. So just the attendance to both workshops, I think it's clear evidence for it. So I have to thank, I didn't do it yesterday properly, so I have to thank all the representatives of the centers in the network for the immediate support I received for this idea, and especially Robin Carsten, the current coordinator of the network. And François Recanati for their encouragement. I think we were sitting having dinner in Budapest when we mentioned this, and they said, oh yeah, that's a good idea, let's do it. In fact, I think it was earlier, it was at one point somewhere François who suggested that it would be a good idea to have something like this, honoring John here in Donostia. So I think I talk on behalf of most, perhaps all of us, if I say that we admire you, John. We learned and still learned a lot from you. And we have been inspired and still are inspired by you in several respects. We can mention his insights and theories and their impact in the philosophy of mind and language, but also in metaphysics, epistemology, logic, semantics, theory of information, psychology, artificial intelligence. We can mention his memorable examples, the messy shopper, the shabby pedagogue, the amnesiac lingens, so forth and so on. We can also mention his effort in spreading philosophy and popularizing it through his writings like, the short dialogues on personal identity and immortality, or the one on the good, evil, and the existence of God, or projects like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, or Philosophy Talk, the radio show. We can mention so many things. We learned another important lesson, I think, which is that philosophy can be fun, and that definitely philosophy is fun with him. In our particular case, philosophers here in Donostia, I have to mention the immense depth we have with him. I think he first came, well, don't trust me on dates and this because I have a very bad memory, but I think the first time was like early 90s, somewhere in the early 90s. By then, some graduate students from here, including myself, started visiting Stanford. Imagine, we arrived in with a very poor English, even almost inexistent English, and very little knowledge of what were the international standards and practices in research. So we discovered there the email or the Macintosh, a little square thing. And while we faced many intellectual giants for us. We met John Barwes, John McCarthy, Stanley Bitters, Solomon Pfefferman, Fred Dresky, Nancy Cartwright, Ivan Sag, Jeff Namberg, Herb Clark, David Israel, so many people. John always supported us, and he kept doing it for years and years. Some of us not only learned about philosophy, we also learned about life. The creation of our institute, ILCLI, was clearly inspired by John's CSLI. Anyway, we tried to acknowledge all this, all he did for us, by getting our university to confer him an honorary doctorate in 2002, I think. But it was not enough to pay our debt that kept growing since then. On the other hand, I'd say he prefers an intense philosophical discussion than a pompous ceremony with rectors and presidents of universities and little governments in gowns. So that's why here we are to discuss his most recent work seriously while we have some fun. So please, John, your turn.
Well, thank you, Kepa, old friend. I mean, friend for a long time, and now really an old friend, right? Not quite decrepit like me, but old. And thanks to all the other people at the Institute, Maria, Larates, I don't want to forget anybody, Josu, and particular to Jesus Marie, who started the whole thing and sustains it with his wit, humor, and wisdom. And thank you for coming. I find myself in an odd position of claiming to have insights about reference and self-consciousness, and yet being unable to work the coffee pot at my hotel. So skepticism is perhaps in question. So the idea is that we've got two lectures. I'm going to start with reference, and from reference go to the concept of a role, which is, I think, very central. That will give us a conception of a looser concept of content than many people are comfortable with or familiar with. Some of you will be familiar with it from my reflexive referential theory, but I've got some new terminology that hopefully will make it more palatable and better organized. And then tomorrow we'll go into the connection of all this with representation, and then finally self-knowledge and the elusive self. So that's a lot to cover, and so let's get started. So part one is roles and reference. So here's two examples of reference I think are fairly straightforward. I say Aristotle had a mole on his back. Now, if you think about it, that's quite miraculous. I have made a statement, don't know whether it's true or false, but it's either true or false, and whether it has that property depends on how things were in Macedonia and Athens thousands of years ago. How can I do something today that has crucial properties that depend on things that no one knows, as far as I know, that happened thousands of years ago? How can I refer to Aristotle? It is a bit of a miracle if you think about it. Another example is I'm watching CNN and I see an interview with a refugee in Turkey from Syria, and she says, "I'm from Damascus," and my wife walks in, I say, "She's from Damascus." I refer to this refugee who I've never met, never laid eyes upon, just seeing an image that's conveyed in a complicated way, and yet in a straightforward way I seem to be able to refer to her, say something about her that I have good reason to believe, but might be false. She might be lying. What I say might be untrue. The point is, the truth or falsity of my statement in Palo Alto, California, depends on a historical fact about this woman in Turkey, whether she was indeed from Damascus or not. And if you think about it, it's kind of miraculous. Now, referring, which is a relation I have at a time to the lady in Damascus and to Aristotle. So it's a relation between me at a time and another individual far away. One suspects, I don't want to get too philosophical here, but one suspects this is not one of the more basic parts of the universe. It's not down there with spinning quarks and so forth, the relation of reference. It must have somehow right on top of lots of more basic things. And so philosophers have the job of trying to figure out as best they can what's involved there and how we get such a concept and why it's useful and why it has the properties it does, given the way it's based in more fundamental reality. And my claim, which I don't think should be controversial, but like most sensible things I say are, it depends on the roles that these people play in our lives. I'll say more about roles. Now there's how I refer to Aristotle. Slightly simplified version. There I am in the lower right. I have a thought. Aristotle had a mole on his back. It just occurs to me. Maybe he did. So I say it. Aristotle had a mole on his back. And I refer all the way back to Aristotle. But I am able to do that somehow because of this intervening chain of events. Causal chain, historical chain, informational chain, the kind of things that Kripke and Donnellan and Gareth Evans talked about, what I call a name-notion structure. There was Aristotle. Aristotle wrote things. People who knew and perceived Aristotle wrote about him. There's Avicenna. He read some of this stuff that the Greeks wrote about Aristotle. Then he wrote some more about Aristotle. And then there's, what's his name, Aquinas. He read Avicenna, I guess, or maybe Averroes. I never can quite get it straight. And it went in libraries and more libraries. And then Will Durant, who wrote the first philosophy book I ever read, The Story of Philosophy, great book. First time I ever heard of Aristotle, I'm pretty sure. That's where I learned the word Aristotle, from Will Durant. And yet I learned it and use it to refer to Aristotle. And I was a pretty good student, so I probably knew a lot about Aristotle, but if I'm giving a lecture in a philosophy class, and the kid's not paying much attention, and he comes up later and he says, Aristotle, did he really exist? Was he like Homer? Was he a poet? What was he anyway? Well, he's referred to Aristotle, even though he doesn't know the first thing about it. Matter of fact, he might not even know that much. He might put his hand up in class and say, this guy, Ari Whatsit, was he a poet or a philosopher? From then on, everybody calls Aristotle in the class Ari Whatsit. So this kid who doesn't even know if Aristotle existed or was a poet or a philosopher has managed to give him a new name. That's kind of amazing. That's how I refer to the refugee. She's there in Turkey. There's a video camera pointed at her, and then there's some transmitting towers, and it ends up in my TV set. That's what we think of now as the flow of information. It's much more dramatic and well organized than the history of the use of the word Aristotle and the ideas we have about Aristotle. But in a way, it gets things down to the graphics. You have a series of connected physical states and events along which information is transmitted. It's a very physical thing. And that's what we know how to do. We know how to build these things. We know how to build structures that preserve information in some clear sense. And we use it, and it supports reference and all sorts of things. So what I mean by a role is a partial function whose value is an object. Function takes us from an object in one domain to a unique object in another domain. A partial function does that sometimes, but it doesn't always get you to the other object. Examples are father of, birthplace of, chair sat on. Sometimes we have to fill in a little with context and eliminate a little vagueness to really get a partial function. Uncle of, I can say, well, you know, who is he? Who gave Kepa his winning smile? Oh, his uncle. Well, he's probably got several uncles, but maybe in the context one of them is salient. Won't worry too much about those issues. Now, the key thing I want to say about roles is to make a distinction that I think has been overlooked and is absolutely crucial. Well, I better be careful with Herman here. Not absolutely crucial, somewhat helpful. If not essential, at least helpful, right? And that's between what I call episode subject roles and subject object roles. So maybe I should go down here. I believe in episodes, events, states, token states that occur in brains for short or long periods of time. When we go back to that flow of information, what we have is a series of events. The woman says something, the TV camera records it. Electricity and electronic signals are sent to the towers, and they're sent from tower to tower, and finally the event happens on my screen, and then finally an event in my brain. It's a story of events. Causal, part of the causal world. Events causing one another. And yet it's also the flow of information, of content. To me, the key philosophical issue, in my humble opinion, is not the semantics of natural language. That's a wonderful topic. I'm really glad that people like Robin know so much about it. Nor is it the metaphysics of necessary and possibly, which is a bizarre thing to worry very much about. It's how episodes have these radically different properties of causation and content, and we expect them to fit together. Kepa wanted to give a talk about me. He had a want with that content to give a little talk about John Perry, and he had a belief that the way to do that was stand here and read from his notes. That belief and that desire caused him to do what he did. That's good. It worked out well. If that belief and that desire had caused Kepa to stand up there, take off all his clothes and sing "Oh Canada," that would have been weird. The content and the causal role of a state need to mesh or the world makes no sense at all. And I think in order to understand how that works, you have to think about the episodes, the physical events and their physical properties, and how the physical events and their physical properties can fit into the system of contents that we use, that we've been bequeathed by what David Lewis calls folk psychology. So I'm big on episodes. I don't want to get rid of episodes in favor of person stages or contexts, which are quadruples, or centered worlds. I want episodes. I hope I've made that clear. So I think the starting point is utterances and thoughts, episodes. And the first roles I want to emphasize are the roles that get us from episodes to the key players in the episode. I'm thinking of cognitive and linguistic episodes, episodes that have content, episodes that we describe with things like propositional attitudes. Kepa thought so-and-so, Kepa said so-and-so. So something happened with Kepa's brain and Kepa's mouth that we can describe with these that clauses, that so-and-so, that such and such. I don't want to Now, so episode roles are basically the subject of, the time of, the location of, the world of, but I won't pay much attention to that. I throw it in there just for comparison with Kaplan's concept of a context. Sometimes I use the word subjects in a somewhat exasperating way for all of these things. So when Kepa had the thought, it's time for the talk to start, that was an episode. That was an event in his brain. He was the subject. The time was about 10 minutes ago or so. There was something that if it had been an utterance, we would have called an expression. Maybe his thinking was in English or Basque, and so we could actually refer to it as an expression, or maybe it was at some more or less articulated level, but there was something going on in his brain that can be assigned content. There was some perturbation in his brain that made it the case, given everything else that was going on, that he had that thought rather than some other thought or no thought at all. That determined, other things being equal, what the content of his thought was. Let's call that the representation. That's the key part. That's a key part of the episode too. So the episode, there are these basic roles that episodes fill. Then the second kind of role, second kind of partial function, is once you get the occupants of these ES roles, episode to subject roles, you get the subject and the time and the expression, then you get roles that take you to objects. These are the objects referred to and thought about. So let's say that Kepa's mind wanders. I shouldn't keep picking on Kepa. He's so nice, and he says such nice things about me. Maybe I'll shift to Dagfinn in a while, but he's nice too. Well, anyway. So maybe Kepa's sitting there thinking, I don't know. The beach must be warm. He's thinking about the beach and warmth. He's doing the thinking, but he's not thinking about himself. He is playing a subject role, but not an object role. If I have the thought, Isidora is taller than Meg Ryan. Something I dwell on for hours at a time. So Isidora is taller than Meg Ryan. So that's a thought about Isidora and Meg Ryan. Isidora could be taller than Meg Ryan. That the content of the thought could be true even if I never existed, or existed but never had the thought. The content of the thought isn't about me at all. It's about Isidora and Meg Ryan. Yet I played a role in getting Isidora and Meg Ryan into the content of the thought. It was because some perturbation in my brain had some feature that contributed them as the objects I was thinking about, that I'm having a thought whose content that Isidora is taller than Meg Ryan. Are you taller than Meg Ryan? Yeah, I think so. So we got two kinds of roles, what I call subject-object roles. You got the time, you got the thinker, maybe some other stuff, and the expression or representation, and those get you to the objects thought about. Those are kind of well recognized. Those are a generalization of Kaplan's notion of characters, we'll see in a minute. But then there's the second kind, from the episode to the subjects. Those are usually glossed over. Matter of fact, maybe it would be helpful to jump ahead to this. I'm sure you're all familiar with Kaplan's system. Kaplan has contexts. Contexts are not centered worlds. They are quadruples of an agent, location, time, and world. The world is just in there to deal with the indexical actual. They're abstract objects. They're sets. Where do they come from? Well, it's pretty obvious that contexts are there to get at properties of utterances and thoughts. I don't think Kaplan would deny that. The agent of a context is usually provided by the speaker or thinker of a thought or utterance. And the thought is the time the episode occurs. The location is the location where it occurs. And the world is the world in which it occurs. Kaplan does not want utterances in his logic because he thinks they get in the way. Thinks they get in the way of a notion of validity because you'd have to say all the premises of the argument at the same time. And he doesn't want to require that the agent of a context say anything at the location of the context at the time of the context, because he wants to be able to use it to evaluate what they would say or might have said. On the other hand, he has a definition in there that the agent of a context needs to be at the location of a context, at the time of a context, in the world of the context. And I think that's clearly inspired by the fact that contexts are sets of attributes of actual occasions. They're modeling sets of attributes of actual occasions. They're abstracting from that. And I don't have any objection to that at all. Kaplan's a wonderful, wonderful work. I'm sure that's the best thing for logic. But it's not the best thing for my project, which is understanding how the content and causal role of episodes interact. There you want real utterances. And there's no use ignoring some degrees of freedom, some mechanisms, some facts that you have. And you have the fact that there are these roles between the episodes and the things that Kaplan's contexts are made up of. As a matter of fact, I think there's a little bit of a problem that results from that. If you think about it, take the word tomorrow, right? Now, in Kaplan's view, tomorrow stands for the day after the time in the context. So tomorrow will be evaluated a context. The context will have a time. The time will occur during some day or another, and tomorrow will refer to the day after that day. But there's really two things going on there. There's the function from a time to the subsequent day, and there's the choice of which time is the argument for that function. Kaplan allows no degree of freedom there. The argument is the time in the context. But if you think, the time in the utterance usually supplies the time we're interested in for tomorrow. But there's no reason it has to. As soon as you realize that you've got two functions, you've got the function from the episode to a time, and then from that time to the referent of tomorrow, then you can say, well, why can't some time that's not playing the episode role play that role as input to the SO role? And that's exactly what happens in what Kaplan calls monsters, which are not really monsters at all. If my mother says to me, as she did probably about 1946, never put off until tomorrow what you can do to today, she was not making a remark about, let's say, May 5th and May 6th, 1946. She intended the input for the today and tomorrow to be from the quantifier never. So I'm getting a little far afield here, but the point is that the flexibility in distinguishing these two different roles, the episode to subject roles and the subject to object roles, is important. So SO roles are functions from occupants of ES roles, and I'd love to get some suggestions for better terminology. It's not one of my strong points. SO roles are associated with representations, names, indexicals, demonstratives, predicates, or inside the mind, notions, ideas. They can be articulated, that is, parts or aspects of representation that can be singled out and maybe appear as parts or aspects of other representations, or they can be what I call unarticulated, called for by the function that the representation's role has in the cognitive economy of whatever it's kind of animal it's a representation of, but not without the separate part or aspect. That'll be a key thing to talk about tomorrow. I have a elaborate version of the causal historical theory that I developed in my book Reference and Reflexivity, which takes name notion networks to be what connect objects we refer to with our acts of reference. And I gave you a picture of one already, the Aristotle one, so that's probably all I need to say about that. Demonstratives, I don't have anything particularly new to say about demonstratives, but typically a demonstrative has a number of different uses. You can say you can use that man to pick out a man perceptually, anaphorically, someone that is salient in some other way. And then basic indexicals. I, here, now. Those are important, or will be important for tomorrow, because they are tied to roles in our lives that are very important independently of language. I have ways of finding out about today that are very primitive. I open my eyes and look, and what is happening today. I don't need to have the notion of today to think about what's happening today. I just need to think about what I can see. Similarly with now and here. There are ways of finding about what's happening now, ways of finding out about what's happening here that are very basic, very primitive, pre-linguistic, and these basic indexicals tie into those. On the other hand, complex indexicals like today, tomorrow, and yesterday really only have a role in human life when a more complex representational system has gotten a start. More about that tomorrow. So there's some examples of SO roles. The point is that to get an SO role, you take whatever you got in mind, like a name, and you make it all capitals, and you put a couple parentheses there, and you put an S for the subject and a T for the time. Most SO roles depend on the subject and the time of the episode, and then they get us to an object, the object thought about or referred to. So Aristotle, as used by me a minute ago when I said Aristotle had a mole, referred to Aristotle, the ancient philosopher. We can imagine a different use of Aristotle, same name, by Jackie Onassis, that referred not to Aristotle, but to Aristotle Onassis. But it's not automatic. It's not just whenever I use the word Aristotle, I refer to the Greek philosopher, because I used it just a minute ago to refer to Aristotle Onassis. And I'm sure that Jackie occasionally referred to Aristotle, the philosopher, even after she married the guy. So it depends a bit on intention, right? If Jackie Onassis were to say, oh, that's Aristotle, my husband. He's not much of a logician. You shouldn't confuse him with Aristotle. Her first use of Aristotle would have been tied by her intentions to a name-notion network that went around about to Onassis and got started when he was born, and his parents said, let's call him Aristotle, or whatever they said, and vice versa. Similarly with that man, it's clearly requires intention to decide what kind of demonstrative being used, perceptual or anaphoric. On the other hand, words like I and today seem to have a lot less latitude for intentions. If you intend to be using English, and you say I, then there's only one person you can be referring to in a literal manner. It's not like Aristotle. So I already talked about the comparison with Kaplan. So let U be an utterance of Aristotle has a mole. The subject of U we'll call S, because we're going to decide who it is. The time of U we'll call T. There's an SO role associated with Aristotle, namely being the origin of the name-notion network that is being exploited by X at T. And that goes back to Aristotle, maybe the philosopher. Now I'm going to move from these different kinds of roles to different kinds of content. What I call the E-content of U will be the worlds in which there is somebody that is the subject of the episode. There is a time that is the time of the episode. There is a person who is whoever the subject of the episode at the time of the episode was using Aristotle to refer to, and that person has a mole on them. Now, why do I call this E-content? Because it's putting conditions on the episode, right? In the parentheses there is the U, the episode. In other words, the truth conditions here include conditions on the episode itself. Now, usually when philosophers talk about truth conditions, they don't mean conditions on the episode. They mean conditions on the objects thought about or referred to. If I say Eros was born in a small town in Switzerland, what are the truth conditions of that? Well, Eros has to have been born in a small town in Switzerland. Doesn't put any conditions on me. It doesn't put any conditions on my utterance. The content can be true even if I never made the utterance, even if I never existed. But that's not the only concept of a truth condition you can have. And sometimes, I will argue, it's useful to look at the conditions the truth of an utterance puts on the utterance itself. And when we do that, I call that E-content. And that means that some of the values of the E roles will not be supplied. Maybe none of them, maybe only some of them. So you're abstracting over some aspect of the E roles, some aspect of the episode, and giving the truth conditions in terms of quantification over what that aspect of the episode must be like. So, for example, if I say Aristotle has a mole, and that's taken literally, so it's the present tense, then to be true, the time of the utterance would have to be during Aristotle's lifetime. I mean, taken real literally. So the truth of the utterance would actually put conditions on the time of the utterance. We usually don't think of it that way. Now, I'm going to try to introduce a new concept here that seems to me very commonsensical, but it strikes a lot of people as absurd. But I'm going to sneak up on it. This is by way of J.M. Mackey's concept of an Inus condition. This is a train wreck. The cause of the train wreck was those wheels in front which came off, right? And when we say, well, I just said the cause of the train wreck. Why don't we say the cause of the train wreck? The wheels coming off were not sufficient for the train wreck, because if the train hadn't been moving, it wouldn't have wrecked just because the wheels came off. They were not necessary for the train wreck. What they were, Mackey says, is an Inus condition, an insufficient but necessary part of an unnecessary but sufficient condition. That is to say, the actual derailment of the train required a whole lot of things to be the case, or involved a whole lot of things being the case, that together were jointly sufficient for the train wreck. But they were not necessary. It could have been wrecked by some other way. In this case, we can imagine it was going around a curve at a fair amount of speed, it was fully loaded, and the wheels fell off. Given all that, that was sufficient to cause the crash. So we have a sufficient condition for the crash that wasn't necessary. And then we have, as a part of that sufficient condition, as a necessary part of that condition, something that was not itself sufficient to bring about the wreck, the wheels falling off. Wheels falling off won't cause a train to wreck if it's not moving, or even if it's moving very slowly. So an Inus condition, very useful concept, and Mackey's point is don't go around saying, what's the cause, what's the cause? You know, you have your theory of the cause, I have my theory of the cause. It's a notion that is not unsystematic, it's not just subjective, but we're always interested in some Inus condition. And why are we interested in it? Well, could be a lot of reasons. In this case, because it's something that shouldn't have happened. Trains are supposed to go around curves, trains are supposed to be fully loaded, trains are supposed to move, but their wheels aren't supposed to fall off. So we focus on that. As the Inus condition, we call that the cause. Maybe there's some responsibility, financial responsibility, moral responsibility involved for the people that didn't keep the wheels greased or do whatever they were supposed to do. So Inus conditions. But it's no more, it's not the only Inus condition. If the train hadn't been moving, it wouldn't have crashed. Its moving was an Inus condition. But if you hired a commission and said, tell us the cause of the train crash, and they came back after spending a lot of money and said, well, we think the train crashed because it was moving. Well, an Inus condition, but not the one you'd want. Well, I want to introduce the notion of an Inust condition, an insufficient but necessary part of an unnecessary but sufficient condition for the truth of an episode, of an utterance or thought. My aim here is trying to desanctify. Manuelo said yesterday that he thought I had too instrumentalist a concept of content, didn't you, wherever you are? Yes. And I agree, except for the word too. I think exactly the right. That is, we've gotten focused on the idea that there is some, just like the cause, there's the content. But what's the real content? Well, it doesn't work that way. What we're looking for, if you think about these roles, if you think about what is involved in my referring to Aristotle, you say, for my utterance to be true, a whole lot of stuff has to be in place. Not just Aristotle having a mole, but there has to be some connection between me and Aristotle. There has to be some connection between my brain and the property of having a mole. Most of the time, we don't care about that stuff. For Perry's utterance, Aristotle has a mole, to be true, the word mole must exist in the English language. Well, that's stupid. That's like saying, the train wouldn't have derailed if it hadn't been moving. But sometimes different combinations of Inus conditions, that is, factors that were given what makes the utterance true or false, given what actually makes the utterance true, let's suppose, there may be different sets of factors that were different interests. More importantly, though, is when the thing isn't true. The different ways something can fail to be true. because that's where a lot of the philosophical mysteries come. So I distinguish between three important einus conditions. First, the O content, that's the object content, that's the ordinary notion of content, I think. Some philosophers like Frege would say, no, it's not ordinary at all, it's a very odd notion of content because it involves singular propositions and they're crazy. But old, odd, ordinary, I sometimes call it official. Anyway, it's the singular propositions like the proposition that Aristotle had a mole that we would ordinarily, I think, take to be the content of my statement, Aristotle had a mole. That's the content we get if all the ES values, all the subject, the expression, the time are filled, and then in addition, all the SO values are filled. Yes, okay, so it was Perry at a certain time using the expression Aristotle had a mole. That's the subject conditions. That's the values of the ES conditions, the episode to subject conditions. And then given the subject, Perry, the time, and the expression, we get the SO roles, and the occupants of those were Aristotle, the property of having a mole, and sometime before 2014, since I used the past tense, or maybe I didn't, I forget. So that's O content. But sometimes we can abstract over some of the values of the ES roles, of the SO roles. Jackie said that Aristotle had a mole on his back. I wonder whether she was talking about Aristotle, the philosopher, or Aristotle, her husband. Well, we don't know. Does that mean we don't know the truth conditions? Well, we don't know the O conditions. We don't know the O content. But we can say, it's true if there is somebody that she was referring to with Aristotle by exploiting a name-notion network that goes back to that person's origin, and that person had a mole on their back. So we can still get at the truth conditions, even if we have to abstract over one of the values, even if we don't know exactly what was talked about, what was thought about. That doesn't stop us from giving a systematic account of the truth conditions, and that's what I call S content. And sometimes it's useful even to backtrack further and to abstract over one or more of the values of the ES roles. Right. So one phrase I like to use is, what else has to be the case? So given that I'm the speaker, T's the time, and Aristotle has a mole on back as the expression, fix the values of SO roles. I was talking about Aristotle the philosopher, not Aristotle the shipping magnate. The property of having a mole on one's back in the sense of a brown discoloration due to dermatological problems, as opposed to a relatively large rodent crawling up your back, right? Fix on past time. Given all that, what else has to be true? Well, Aristotle has to have had one of those brown colorations at that time. That's the O content. O content, as I said, has seemed very mysterious to people. Why? Well, because it's so divorced from the human mind. I mean, think about that picture I had of Aristotle. So here's the O content of my remark, goes back to this issue in, I don't know, 300 BC or 400 BC or BC sometime or another, when Aristotle walked the earth. It has to do with the guy back then and whether he has a discoloration on his back. And somehow we're using that to characterize my mind or my utterance, because we're saying Perry believes that, or Perry said that Aristotle had a mole on his back. I mean, if you think about it, that's kind of amazing. And that is so remote from my mind, how could it do a good job characterizing my mind? So the whole idea that we go around characterizing people's minds by such things that are so remote as objects that existed years ago has seemed very odd to people. O content seems very odd to people. On the other hand, there's a lot of intuitions, whatever credence we want to give them after reading Herman's book, that suggests that we do individuate contents in terms of objects and properties what I call the O content, the last thing necessary for them to be true, given all the connections in place. Well, the reason we do that is because we're often not interested in using contents as a guide to human psychology. We're interested in using contents as a guide to human information sharing. We're abstracting from the connections and focusing on the common values that different connections can have. That's what O content is all about. If you go back to think of the different ways that each of the things in that chain is related to the woman from Damascus. Right? Her own utterance emerges out of her mouth. The image on the camera is due to constraints involving light and the construction of the camera. The state of the first receiving tower is due to constraints about electronic transmission. And the same with the second, and then the last constraint that leads to the image on my screen is due to the way TVs are made and cables, not electronic so much as cables, fiberglass cables work. And then the last to my eye is based on human vision. So vastly different constraints, vastly different things going on. What do they all have in common? Given the way the world works, if you fix all the connections, they will all be true or false depending on the same last thing, the last thing that has to be true for them to be, namely whether she's from Damascus or not. So O content is what we try to preserve when we have information handling systems, whether they be libraries or CNN. How much time do I have? 20 minutes? I'm generous. Oh, yeah, you are generous. Okay. Well, then in that case, maybe I'll do a little political philosophy too. So the I-ness condition, the O content, the one that says, let's leave everything in place, let's get all the values, the ES values, the SO values, and then they just look at the last thing that has to be the case for this thing to be true. That's relevant when we're considering how different episodes put the same conditions on the world. Speculation, the attitudes in folk psychology. I like this idea of folk psychology. David Lewis, David Armstrong, I don't accept the letter of the way they were thinking about it. But the general idea that it's an amazing fact that we have this battery of concepts that were developed by our ancestors when they didn't even know that the brain was the thing that was doing all the work, that worked so well that we're able to organize conferences and get married and all sorts of other interesting things based on our views about what we believe and other people believe and what they said and so forth. And it's amazing it works this well. It must be getting something right. So folk psychology is a very interesting subject, but it's wrong to think, and I think this is where Lewis, maybe even Stolnicker go wrong, it's wrong to think that it's basically a psychological theory. It's basically a theory that developed to handle content, holding a lot of psychological things fixed and unquestioned, and then slowly developed into something like that. So we shouldn't expect that the main concept of content in folk psychology, O content, is really all that tied to things like inference that people expect content to be helpful with respect to. S content. Now for S content, we abstract over some values of SO roles. That means we're getting closer to the subject. We're not just putting truth conditions as demands on the objects thought about, but also on there being objects that are thought about in a certain way. If I say Jackie believes that Aristotle had a mole, well, that's bad because she. If I believe Kepa believes that Aristotle had a mole, I haven't told you anything about how he thinks about Aristotle. He may have suggested that he thinks about him with the name Aristotle, but he may not. What's the Basque name for Aristotle? Yeah. See, something sounds completely different. I'm just saying there's some way or another he has a thinking about that guy, and relative to that way of thinking about him, he thinks he has a mole. Doesn't tell you much about what's going on. If I abstract over, I don't know who he's thinking about, but he's thinking about it in this way with this Basque term, Aristotle. What's it? I'm getting closer to the subject. I'm putting demands on the subject. Ordinary notion of content doesn't put demands on the subject unless the subject uses the word I and gets himself into the content. But when we abstract over that, now we're putting demands on the subject. E-content, we'll talk more about later. E-content puts conditions not just on the objects thought about, not just on the subject and the time they're thought about, but on the very episode itself. Imagine your answering machine. Well, let's see, you must call me today. You know, you have one of those irritating people that leaves a completely unhelpful message on your answering machine. You get back after a week's vacation and it says, you must call me today. Well, who are you? What day did you call? Maybe you have a good answering machine that tells you what day you called, or maybe you have a Comcast answering machine like I do that doesn't tell you what day they called. Very irritating. Do you know the truth conditions of this? Well, yes. It's true if I was required to call whoever was the subject of that episode on whatever day was the day of the episode. So I've given you the truth conditions in terms of requirements on the subject and the day. If I recognize the voice, well, Isidora wouldn't be that irritating. Fred called me. I recognize his voice. All he said was, you must call me today. I don't know when it was. Well, now I know that what he said was true if I must call Fred on whatever day he called. Still E-content because I'm still putting some conditions on the episode itself. If I know it's Fred and Tuesday, then I say to my wife, I was supposed to call Fred Tuesday. That could be true even if he hadn't left a message. Even if there were no subject to the episode, no episode at all. So, the kind of content, the I-ness condition, depends on what you're focusing on, what you're putting conditions on. Now, putting S-content to work. So as I want to show, the notion of S-content is really what we need to solve the traditional puzzles about reference. This isn't news, it's more a way of calibrating my terminology with stuff that you already all accept, except some few of you who are content worshippers and beyond reason. So Hesperus is phosphorus, Hesperus is Hesperus. Frege's example, or near kin to Frege's example, it's a very interesting example because apparently the Babylonians associated Hesperus with the evening star and phosphorus with the morning star. Do I have that right? So it would have been news to them that phosphorus is visible in the evening, right? Did I get that right? However, almost all modern philosophers like myself, even though we write about this example over and over again, each time we write about it, have to look up on Wikipedia and see which one is associated in our minds with the evening star and which one is associated in our minds with the morning star, unless Stacie's sitting there and can just tell us, right? But anyway, from the point of view, the O content is the same. The S content is different. That is to say, the S content for the first requires that there be something that plays the Hesperus role relative to the subject and the time that the name is used. And that there be something that plays the phosphorus role for the subject at that time, and that they be the same object. And the second one does not require that. Hesperus is Hesperus, puts no requirements on an occupant for the phosphorus role, and therefore different information. Jacob Horn drank a lot of ale. Jacob Horn, for those of you who don't know, comes from Dunellen. He found this book about Jacob Horn, which it was a fraudulent book. It was the Diaries of Jacob Horn. It was believed for about 10 years that they had discovered diaries that showed that this interesting colonial did a lot of things, and then it was discovered it was all a hoax. So people said, believed, debated about, saying things like, Jacob Horn drank a lot of ale. But wait a minute. Oh, there's no O content there at all. Or if there is O content, we say, well, maybe any empty name refers to the set containing the null set or something like that. But then Jacob Horn drank a lot of ale and Sherlock Holmes drank a lot of ale, give you the same proposition. Much better to rely on S content. Even if Jacob Horn drank a lot of ale, doesn't have any O content. There is no singular proposition. You don't have to go invent one by finding some abstract object and pretending that we're referring to it. Everything you need is already there. You can say, oh yeah, the truth conditions of Jacob Horn drank a lot of ale that are relevant here are that there be someone who is the origin of the name notion network that is being exploited using the term Jacob Hale, and that person drank a lot of ale. And those truth conditions aren't satisfied because, as Denellen says, there's a block. So again, that kind of solution, which I think is the correct solution to the case of fictional content, that's how it fits in with my picture. And Kripke's Pierre I'll leave as a exercise for the reader. Putting e-content to work. Now, it's a little harder to find a really convincing example where you need e-content, but here's one I think is pretty good. It's almost midnight. Kepa and I are celebrating the new year in my living room in Palo Alto. And Kepa, with his indefatigable interest in the oddities of language, has been looking forward all day to being able to say, right as the second hand goes past 12, starting just before then, ending just after then, today is yesterday. Could be true, right? If he does it just right, then he will refer to, say, December 31st, 2014, with today, and he will also refer to December 31st, 2014 with yesterday because he will be using that on January 1st, 2015. But knowing his ambitions, I've set the clock a little fast. So I can say, nope, you're wrong. Today is still today. So the point is, if we want to understand how those could have been right or how those could have been wrong, interestingly enough, SO content doesn't quite do the work. Why? Well, at least if you assume that there's a necessary connection between a time and the day on which it occurs, so that metaphysically a given time couldn't have occurred on a different day, then you can't get at the... Let's suppose that my statement is true, but it could have been false if Kepa had snuck in and changed it back. The conditions under which my statement is false, you can't get at in terms of S content, unless I've made a mistake, which is likely, but you can in terms of E content, that is. What would have had to have been different is the time on which the utterance occurred. So E content has its role too, although it's actually not so important for solving traditional philosophical language puzzles as for understanding representation, which we'll talk about tomorrow. Now, I just want to say a few things of a rather preacherly way, and I want to sermonize a little here. There's three pictures of the attitudes traditionally, right, which I'll call Fregean, Fodorian, and hybrid. I mean, there's a lot of variations, but the Fregean picture is, well, propositional attitude is an attitude towards proposition, which is some kind of abstract entity that's true or false, possibly in a Platonic heaven, maybe not quite as exalted in that. The Fodorian picture is, no, that's wrong. That's wrong. A propositional attitude is having a sentence in the appropriate box in your brain. If I believe that Aristotle had a mole on his back on Frege's view, there's this proposition in heaven that's associated in my mind with the phrase Aristotle had a mole on his back, would involve some description of Aristotle. Maybe Plato's most famous student had a mole on his back. Of course, that involves Plato. The most famous student of Socrates' most famous student had a mole on his back. The most famous student of Xanthippus' husband. I guess I'm not going to ever, but anyway. On Fodor's view, no, you don't need all that crap. You just got this sentence in your belief box. And then there's the hybrid view. The hybrid view says, no, look, think about human action. When you act, you make a movement and thereby bring about a result. That's what you do and how you do it. And it's similar with belief. There's how you do it and what you do, how you believe and what you believe. That's so maybe we do have belief boxes with sentences in them. Not the world's most subtle theory of the nature of the mind, but let's suppose it's right. But those sentences wouldn't be what you believe. They would be the subjective contribution to what you believe, just as like the movements you make are the subjective contribution to what you do. But then what you believe would also depend on intervening circumstances. So that's the hybrid view, that's my view. That's interesting. I could have just done that. So that's what, keep those three views in mind, and if you think about them, you'll see that the only plausible one is the third one, right? The second thing is I think there's a lot of confusion between representations and propositions. Historically, proposition was used for a sentence, or particularly a mental sentence, back in medieval times. You still see this use in Russell. But in Russell, you also see the use of a proposition as an abstract object, the bearer of truth and falsity, which was unequivocally what Frege meant by a thought. And because the word thought, or Gedanke, was not a very good choice for what Frege had in mind, which was not supposed to be mental, the term proposition came to occupy the space as a translation for what Frege had in mind. And propositions now are used that way. Propositions are thought to be sets of possible worlds, or functions from possible worlds to truth values. These are not representations. You can't see them. Representations are things that have causes and effects, like words. You produce words. People perceive words, and then they act differently based on the words that they perceived you as making, and that's why you made them. Or mental representations. Quite different from words, but still things that have content, and they're in there to do some causal work. If Kepa tells me the restaurant we're eating at tonight, is down that street and to the right, he's trying to produce a representation in me that will make me behave differently than if it weren't there. A set of possible worlds isn't part of the causal realm, even if the possible... Anyway, shouting won't make my point any clearer. So you get, now the term representation is used a lot of different ways, like in science there's representation theorems and so forth. But if we're in cognitive science, where we're really talking about representations as things that are produced, brain states or utterances, it's very confusing to confuse propositions and representations. Propositions are, in my humble opinion, abstract objects that encode, according to some formula or another that the people that use them come up with, truth conditions, right? So you got a set of possible worlds, and then you add to that the proviso that set is a proposition that's true if the actual world is in the set. Now you've got a set of possible worlds that encodes truth conditions. You could equally say a proposition is a set of possible worlds that's false if the actual world is a member of the set. That would be a much less useful concept, much more confusing, but anyway. So propositions, abstract objects, whether you think they're in a Phrygian realm or you think they're somehow objects of human invention and manipulation, are not representations in the sense in which mental representations and utterances are representations. This is important because of another debate. This is sometimes called the externalism debate. Some argue that propositions cannot be what we really and truly believe because they are individuated by things outside our mind, like Aristotle. Believing such a thing couldn't simply be a matter of one's mental states. Well, if propositions were representations, and we were thinking mental representations, and mental representations had to be inside the mind, that might be a pretty good argument. But it's not a good argument, because propositions are not mental representations. Some people say, well, look, if you're going to say that we can believe singular propositions, then then you got to accept this. You got to say, well, look, believing that Aristotle had a mole on his back is a mental property, it's a mental state. So some argue that all propositions cannot be what we really and truly believe because since they are individuated by things outside our mind, like Aristotle, believing such a thing couldn't simply be a matter of one's mental states. Well, it's not just a matter of one's mental states. The term state, like the term proposition, is misused by philosophers. The states of the system, whether it's a mechanism or a human being, an organism or a flea, are properties that arise from the structure of the parts and the way they're put together. The intrinsic properties of the parts and the way they're put together. That's the state of a thing. Things have lots of properties that aren't states, including minds. I don't think my belief that Aristotle had a mole on his back is a mental state. It's a mental property that I have partly in virtue of my mental states, what's going on in my head, and partly in view of circumstances. In different circumstances, I might be in the same mental state and have a much different mental property. And I have an extended example of an automobile transmission, but I'll spare you that. Is that about it?
Minus 5 minutes.
Okay, minus 5. Probably time to quit then. Thank you.
So how do we go now?
That's Windows. I don't know. Just how do you do this? I think should go. Se vê que chegou. Oui. You want this?
Okay, many thanks, Kepa, for having me here, and thanks, John, for being here with us. It's an honor, and I thank all the organizer and Ilkley for putting together this workshop. So what I'm trying to do today is to focus on or at least, because the paper by Perry, and to focus on a couple of notions, what he developed in the paper. So, and Perry, one of the notions I will focus on, or I try to focus on, is what Perry claimed that the name notion network theory is somewhat similar to the historical chain of reference, in particular Donnellan, Evans, Gitch, and so on. So what I will doing here is I may try first to see how Perry's and also Kurta and Perry in 2011 paper, the name notion network and the Donnellan-Kripke chains of reference, well, we may bear some difference. Donnellan's got kind of a revival lately, and there has been quite a bit of a debate about Donnellan and recently about the difference between Donnellan and Kripke. Well, it seems what, at least according from the recent literature, it seems that what we got, the picture we got out from Kripke and Donnellan, we are, from a philosophical viewpoint, we are quite different. And, well, my aim would say to say, well, this kind is whether or not, I'm not here to take a part in favor of Donnellan or Kripke. Well, we must say that my aim at the end of the day will be that, well, if we go along with Perry in particular, if we buy into Perry's what I call, or what sometimes have been called pluripropositionalism, the Kripke-Donnellan debate can be somewhat step aside. So, well, while what came out from the literature roughly, and here I'm going to be quite fast, is what, according to Kripke, what Kripke was holding concerning the social, the causal chain is a kind of a social conception concerning the way name relate to the bearer. Well, whether Aristotle referred to Aristotle using the name Aristotle because of previous uses of the name. The name belonged to the common language. So, well, Aristotle, the name, to borrow from Kaplan, 89, the name come prepackaged with its semantic value. Well, so a name is historically related to the bearer, and or tokening of that name inherits the semantic value from previous tokenings. So we refer to Aristotle vicariously. This is what Kripke say. In general, reference depends not just on what they think or self, but on other people in the community. The history of how the name reached one and things like that. It is by following such a history what one gets to the reference. So, as semantic is concerned here, we can, if we borrow from Kaplan 89 again, well, we can say or characterize this view as kind of consumerist semantics. Well, it seems, at least from recent literature on Donnellan, well, what Donnellan, instead of buying into a Kaplan consumerist semantic, was more into a kind of what following Kaplan, what Kaplan was characterizing against in 89, a kind of subjectivist semantics. So Donnellan historical explanation seems to make no room from a reference borrowing. Each time we token a name, we sort of fix the reference anew. Well, this line of thought, it seems to me, it seems to be suggested or substantiated by Donnellan assimilation of proper name to his treatment of the referential use of definite description. And here it's worth quoting Donnellan when he say, my account of proper names seems to me to make what I call referential definite definitions a close relative of proper names. Well, when we use a definite description in a referential way, one of the key notions in Donnellan is the notion of having in mind or having someone or something in mind. So Donnellan paradigmatic example exemplifying the referential use of description are made, and this is quite revealing, using misguided definite description. Furthermore, in characterizing the referential use of definite description, Keith Donnellan appealed to Russell's notion of acquaintance, and he assimilated the referential use of description to Russell's genuine name. So, well, and this is what, if one say, for example, Socrates knows, the natural view seems to me to be that the singular expression Socrates is simply a device used by the speaker to pick out what he wants to talk about, and so on and so forth. So, this picture could be also highlighted if one were to appeal to an example, a famous example made by Barwise and Etchemendy when you are watching a poker game and you say Claire has a good hand or whatever, the 5 of ace, and well, what you say may be true or false. even or is false if Claire doesn't have it, or if Claire is not the relevant player in there, and it's true or it can be false even if it happened what Claire is playing in another town and she happened to have the ace of whatever, the good hand. So this kind of explanation seems to me to fit Donnellan account. If one were to buy into Kripke causal theory, what John say is true insofar as C, inheriting Claire semantics value from previous uses refer to Claire who happened to have the ace of heart. Well, in this kind of case, it will be hard to claim that in such a situation John has Claire in mind. So, one way to defend the Kripke causal chain against it would be to bring in Kripke versus Donnellan and Kripke semantic reference versus speaker reference. But, well, here I'm going to skip. And, well, but it seems that Donnellan, first of all, in never frame his distinction using the speaker semantic within the framework of speaker semantic reference. Furthermore, it seems that for Donnellan, the speaker, so-called speaker reference and semantic reference cannot be severed, cannot be separated. So, furthermore, and here is a point I may like to stress, furthermore, as Kaplan in a recent paper is put it, Donnellan's notion of having in mind does not rest on one having a proper name in his or her ideolect. It does not rest on one perceiving or having perceived the reference. So this is an interesting quote, quite surprising, but coming from Kaplan, the last Kaplan. He said, Donnellan once said to me what he could imagine the name Aristotle having been first introduced in the Middle Age by scholars who previously had used only definite description to write and speak about Aristotle. According to Donnellan, this scholar may well have had Aristotle in mind, and thought where conversation through the referential use of definite description and other devices passed the epistemic state of having Aristotle in mind from one to another. So thus we were properly situated from an epistemic point of view to be able to introduce a proper name. So, well, through language is what it seems, and this is the picture coming out of one understanding we got from the recent literature on Donnellan. The picture what seems to emerge is that through language is what permits us to think about past individuals. The presence of proper names may play no essential role in our ability to transmit having in mind. After all, many things we have in mind do not bear a name. So, and Kaplan, well, and here Kaplan recently changed quite drastically, it seems to me, his viewpoint. He said what Kaplan recognized what in his previous work, and here I quote, he had the relation between name and having in mind backward. The name rides on the having in mind, not vice versa. So, well, and here I would try to bring in Perry's recent work on Perry and Court as well, Court and Perry. So, and here in trying to deal and how to see how this kind of debate can be passed by using the notion, name notion network and the idea of transmission and roles. So, well, the notion of having in mind, well, we can claim that it plays a central stage when dealing with problems pertaining to cognitive significance, communication, explanation of behavior, and so on and so forth. Well, so a theory of meaning aiming to account for communication and understanding must be, to borrow from Corta and Perry once again, utterance-bound and ought to consider the variegated way a subject can have someone or something in mind, if we accept this kind of parlance on having something in mind. So, and here is when Perry introduced the notion of role and so on. So Perry's role, it seems to me, we play a crucial part when we come to, as he just stressed, when we come to characterize a agent's cognitive life. Since the very same object can be apprehended and so represented in different ways, the referent can affect the cognizer mind in variegated ways. So it is so the agents come to have the object in mind, that helps dealing with puzzle pertaining to cognitive significance, and role are also what help explaining someone's behavior, and so on and so forth. So and here is where the Perry distinction is just introduced between SO, subject-object role, and episode subject role. Well, what take the episode of speech or thought themselves as argument and deliver the subject as well as the time and place, and so on and so forth. So furthermore, it seems to me what the subject episode role help classifying the representation. Here we have to insist classifying somewhat the representation involved. It is at this point that Perry's pluripropositionalism come into the forum. So a simple utterance, so to frame the debate in the pluripropositionalist language, a simple utterance come equipped with different content, proposition or truth condition, different role help characterizing different aspect and property of the utterance used. A role can put condition on the subject matter, the proposition express, or the Kaplanian content. Well, but a different role can put condition on the utterance itself and the agent of it. It's the latter that helps classifying the speaker's cognitive life involved in his or her utterance of the sentence. So it's the latter what helps us dealing with so-called or kind of problem pertaining to cognitive significance. So without entering the detail of Perry's pluriproposition, I'd like now to stress how it relates to his notion of transmission of information and the name notion network. So, as we saw, Donnell and Kripke seems to have different view concerning a causal chain of reference. Let's just accept it for sake of argument. Well, while Kripke focuses on the way a token proper name inherited semantic value from previous uses, Donnell seems to suggest that each token of a name, of a proper name, fixes the reference anew. The question what I'd like now to put forward is how Perry and at the same time Court and Perry notion of name notion network does fit within this kind of two alternatives. So on one side, Perry seems to subscribe to the Kripkean view that when he claimed that his use of Aristotle is linked to the Greek philosopher via a network of communication related to the referent. On the other side, Perry insists about information transmission and how we come to have notion stored in our mind. And here we can remind Perry speaking or Perry when he introduced or discussed the notion of having a mental file about Aristotle, what we think and talk about him. So this amount to say, it seems to me, what in the pluripropositionalist parlance, what the official referential Kaplanian content and the reflexive content triggered by the utterance, the speaker episode, are both crucially important. And when we come to characterize what a speaker say and how when we are important, when we come to characterize what the speaker say and how she say it or thought it. So it seems that the what and the how they cannot be severed or divorced. It is the episode speaker role that help us to deal with problems pertaining to cognitive significance. It's the latter what help us classifying what goes on in an agent mind when that contribute to trigger his or her behavior. So in adopting pluripropositionalism, the Donnell and Crick debate can somewhat be sidestepped insofar as Perry's view can be considered as a hybrid of the two positions. So for Kripke, causal chain pertain to what Perry characterized or somewhat the SO role, and it is what determines the object entering the proposition express, or so-called the Kaplanian content. This is so-called, we could call the name network. On the other hand, the notion network, characterized by Perry episode speaker role, is what delivers how the speaker gets the relevant referent in mind. And so, furthermore, it is the notion network that allows a speaker to accumulate and pass information concerning a given referent. Most of the time, we face no problem. The object one has in mind is the object one thought the name network via the name network referred to. The name network and the notion network works in parallel. Well, it can happen, though, what the object one has in mind through the notion network and the one she has in mind through the name network differ. In some cases, as in Donnellan example concerning the medieval scholars introducing the name Aristotle, people can pass information on the individual they have in mind without them having the name at their disposal. So the passing of information from one speaker to the other, the passing of whom they have in mind, can be sustained by a notion network without having to appeal to a name network. The name network and the notion network in some awkward cases can run in different directions, for instance, like in the Barrois H. Mendy case with the Clare and the hand of poker. And, well, as we saw, while Kripke endorses what Kaplan characterized as a kind of consumerist semantics, Donnellan seems to subscribe to a form of subjectivist semantics. Well, Perry speakers or Perry thinkers, well, are both consumerist and subjectivist. They are consumerist for they are embedded in a name network, and they are subjectivist insofar as they are embedded in a notion network. We are consumerist insofar as we refer to Aristotle by using the public name Aristotle, while we are subjectivist insofar as we have a notion or a file in their mind of Aristotle. So in short, one is compelled to choose between a Kripke style or a Donnellan style chain of reference if one embraces monopropositionalism, namely the view what all the relevant information pertaining to a communicative or thinking episode is encapsulated into a single proposition. If one, to use Barrois and Perry, commits the fallacy of misplaced information. So if so, we have to choose between whether it is the proposition the speaker semantically express or the one what she intends to communicate, having the intended referent as a constituent, what contributing the passing of information from one speaker to his or her audience. Well, if one, on the other hand, if one embraces pluripropositionalism, a framework championed by Perry, one need not choose between these two whole. The proposition expressed by a given utterance differs from the one created, to use Perry's 88 terminology, or reflexive truth condition or reflexive content. So, both proposition can contribute in the passing of information and in the success of communication. So it seems that Kripke style and Donnellan style chain of reference and communication can sit side by side when we come to explain communication problem pertaining to cognitive significance, reference fixing, and information transmission. Thank you. Thanks, John. Thank you.